Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of those moments where Hollywood's carefully polished image begins to crack. And when it does, what spills out isn't glamour, talent, or grace. What spills out is power, manipulation, and entitlement hiding behind celebrity smiles. Because today is not a good day for Taylor Swift. And it is certainly not a good day for Blake Lively. For years, we've been told a very specific story. A story about innocence. About staying out of creative decisions. About having no influence, no control, no involvement in a film that erupted into legal chaos behind the scenes. That story has now been challenged, not by rumors, not by gossip blogs, but by messages entered into court filings. And once something reaches the courtroom, this is no longer celebrity chatter. This becomes a matter of credibility. Now, let me be very clear from the start. This is not about liking or disliking any one individual. This is not about defending one party or attacking another because of personal feelings. This is about what the evidence appears to show, and why the public narrative no longer matches what was happening privately. Because when text messages emerge showing strategic discussions, coordinated planning, and influential voices weighing in on creative direction, it raises serious questions. Especially when those same individuals publicly stated they had nothing to do with it. And that's where this story becomes uncomfortable. According to filings connected to an ongoing federal legal dispute, private communications between Blake Lively and Taylor Swift reveal conversations that go far beyond casual venting between friends. These were not offhand remarks. These were not emotional moments blown out of proportion. These were discussions involving script changes, creative leverage, strategic positioning, and how to apply influence in a way that reshaped a production. And for an audience that values honesty, transparency, and accountability, particularly those who've lived long enough to recognize patterns of power misuse, this hits differently. Because many of you watching today remember a time when studios ran films, not celebrity alliances. When actors acted, directors directed, and musicians stayed out of film negotiations unless contractually involved. That line, according to these documents, may have been crossed. Court materials indicate that Blake Lively privately criticized the film's director in extremely harsh terms to multiple people in her inner circle, including individuals who hold enormous weight in Hollywood. And one of those people was Taylor Swift. More importantly, Taylor Swift did not respond as a neutral bystander. Instead, messages suggest that she offered support, advice, and strategic insight, including commentary on how her music could be used as leverage within the project, and how that leverage could shift power dynamics. That matters, because when Taylor Swift later stated publicly that she had no role in influencing creative decisions, no involvement in meetings, and no participation in steering the direction of the film, these private communications now raise doubts about those claims. This is not about swearing. This is not about name-calling. This is not about celebrities venting the way regular people do about co-workers. This is about coordination. It's about planning. It's about using status and access to influence outcomes, while telling the public the opposite. And for older viewers especially, this pattern is not new. Many of you have seen powerful figures quietly manipulate systems while presenting a completely different face to the public. That's why this story resonates. Because the issue here isn't celebrity drama, it's credibility. Documents submitted to the court describe a meeting that took place at Blake Lively's residence. A meeting involving the director and individuals who, according to public statements, were never supposed to be involved in creative approvals. And yet, according to the filings, Taylor Swift attended and endorsed a revised version of the script. That endorsement, coming from one of the most powerful entertainment figures on the planet, carried weight whether anyone wants to admit it or not. Afterward, messages reportedly exchanged between Lively and Swift praised the outcome of the meeting and reflected a sense of success. Not relief, not gratitude, victory. And this is where the tone shifts from friendly support to strategic execution. Because when messages reference patterns, power, and anticipating reactions from the other side, it stops sounding like casual conversation and starts sounding like planning. Meanwhile, the director at the center of the dispute has claimed that control of the project was effectively taken out of his hands, with scenes rewritten and decisions overridden by a coalition of celebrity influence. Blake Lively has disputed aspects of that claim, but the messages themselves are now part of the public record. And the ripple effects don't stop there. According to the same filings, Blake Lively allegedly spoke negatively about the director to other well-connected figures in Hollywood, including actors and producers who themselves operate major studios. When those people become aware of behind-the-scenes narratives, it can affect careers, reputations, and future opportunities, even if no formal action is taken. That's why this matters. Because power in Hollywood doesn't just exist in contracts. It exists in conversations. And those conversations, when coordinated, can change outcomes. What's particularly striking is how wide this circle appears to be. High-profile names, industry titans, people with nothing to gain by being dragged into someone else's legal fight, now referenced in court materials. And for Taylor Swift, this creates a serious problem. Her brand has been built carefully over decades. Strategic silence, controlled messaging, a public image of emotional authenticity paired with professional boundaries. But these messages suggest that behind the scenes, those boundaries may not have existed in the way fans were led to believe. That doesn't mean wrongdoing has been proven. It does not mean guilt has been established. But it does mean the narrative has changed. And once the narrative changes, silence becomes noticeable. Which brings us to the present. Observers have noted a visible distance between Taylor Swift and Blake Lively in recent months. Public appearances have shifted. Interactions once expected are now absent. And in Hollywood, absence often speaks louder than words. Because when legal exposure increases, public association becomes risk. And when teams step in, they don't advise loyalty, they advise survival. This case is approaching trial. And as more filings emerge, more private communications may enter the public record. For viewers who value integrity, who believe that influence should be acknowledged, not denied, this moment feels like a reckoning. Not because celebrities talked badly about someone, but because they allegedly did so while shaping outcomes, then told the public they weren't involved at all. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where trust begins to erode. What makes this situation especially troubling is not just what was said, but who was involved and how far the influence appears to have reached. Because once private communications are entered into court filings, they stop being gossip. They stop being speculation. They become exhibits. And when those exhibits reveal patterns of coordination among some of the most powerful names in entertainment, the consequences extend well beyond one film. At the center of this dispute is a fundamental question. Who is really steering the ship? According to legal claims now on the record, Blake Lively did not simply express dissatisfaction with the direction of the film. She allegedly positioned herself as the central decision-maker, rewriting scenes, restructuring key moments, and directing the overall tone of the project behind the scenes. Now, actors can absolutely contribute creatively. That happens all the time. But the issue here is not contribution, it's control. Because when an actor with enormous celebrity leverage coordinates with other powerful figures to override the director and reshape a project, that crosses into a very different territory. And according to the filings, this is exactly what the director claims occurred. What escalated matters further was the alleged involvement of outside influencers. Not producers, not executives, but friends. Friends with massive platforms, massive reach, and massive cultural influence. One of those friends was Taylor Swift. Now again, it must be said, no court has ruled on these matters yet. These are allegations supported by communications now under legal review. But the optics alone are devastating. Because once Taylor Swift's name appears in a court filing tied to discussions about strategy, power, and creative leverage, her previous statements denying involvement no longer sit comfortably. And this is where legal exposure becomes reputational exposure. Court documents indicate that Blake Lively reached out to multiple high-profile figures, allegedly sharing negative characterizations of the director and framing herself as the one holding the production together. These weren't random friends. These were individuals who operate studios, greenlight projects, and shape careers. When someone in that position hears a consistent narrative from a trusted peer, it carries weight, whether intended or not. And for an older audience watching this unfold, the pattern is familiar. It resembles what happens in corporate boardrooms, political circles, and elite institutions, where influence is rarely exercised publicly, but often quietly, through trusted relationships. That's why this story feels less like celebrity drama and more like a case study in soft power. According to the filings, Blake Lively allegedly framed the director as unstable, unprofessional, and incapable of leading the project. Those descriptions were reportedly shared with people who had no official role in the production, but who possessed enormous industry sway. And here's where things spiral. Because when influential people begin discussing a director's competence, based on one side's narrative, it can close doors long before any facts are tested. That is why courts take this kind of coordination seriously. If proven, it raises questions about interference, misrepresentation, and intent. The documents further suggest that Taylor Swift provided insight into how her music could affect the film's power dynamics. Specifically, the idea that including her work in promotional materials could shift leverage away from the director and toward Blake Lively's position. Whether or not that advice was acted upon is almost beside the point. The point is that it was discussed, and discussing strategy implies involvement, which brings us to the widening circle of names now associated with this dispute. Several high-profile actors and producers, individuals who have worked decades to maintain reputations of professionalism, are now mentioned in filings as recipients of Blake Lively's concerns. And for those individuals, this is not a harmless mention, because once a legal case enters discovery, subpoenas become a possibility. Text messages, emails, phone records, and no one in Hollywood wants their private communications dissected in federal court. This is especially concerning for those who run production companies, studios, or financing entities, where perception of ethical conduct is critical. And this is where public relations teams begin to panic, because what starts as one lawsuit can quickly become a network of exposure, pulling in people who never expected to be involved. That's why we're now seeing distance. That's why public associations are cooling. That's why silence has become the dominant strategy. For Taylor Swift, the risk is particularly acute. Her career has survived controversies before, but this situation is different. This is not about lyrics, relationships, or artistic expression. This is about credibility under oath. And once a person's statements are contradicted by documented communications, the issue becomes not just reputation, but trust. Trust with fans, trust with collaborators, trust with the industry. And for viewers who value honesty, who grew up believing that integrity matters more than image, this is deeply unsettling, because it suggests that public narratives may have been carefully crafted to obscure private realities. Meanwhile, Blake Lively's legal position faces its own challenges. According to filings, the director claims that his authority was systematically undermined, not through formal channels, but through coordinated influence and pressure. If a court finds that such actions occurred, it could set a significant precedent about the limits of celebrity involvement in creative control. And that matters for the future of filmmaking. Because if star power becomes a substitute for contractual authority, the industry changes fundamentally, and not for the better. What's particularly damaging is the tone of some of the communications now described in filings. A tone that suggests confidence in winning not because of merit, but because of alliances. That perception alone is enough to damage public trust. As this case moves closer to trial, more information is expected to surface. More communications may be reviewed. More narratives may unravel. And for those watching closely, especially those who've lived through eras of unchecked power in institutions, this feels like a moment of reckoning. Not just for individuals, but for a system that often protects influence over fairness. If there is one thing Hollywood understands better than storytelling, it is risk management. And right now, what we are witnessing is not confusion, coincidence, or scheduling conflicts. What we are witnessing is containment. Because when legal pressure begins to mount, when private communications enter public filings, and when powerful names appear where they never expected to be, the industry does not react emotionally. It reacts strategically. That is why the silence has been so noticeable. That is why once visible friendships now appear distant. That is why people who once stood front and center are suddenly nowhere to be found. For older viewers especially, this pattern is unmistakable. You've seen it in politics. You've seen it in corporate scandals. You've seen it in cases where influence once operated freely, until exposure made proximity dangerous. And that is exactly what is happening here. Taylor Swift, a figure whose public presence has been meticulously controlled for years, has gone notably quiet on this issue. No clarifications, no statements, no subtle messaging, just absence. And in public relations, absence is rarely accidental. When a situation is harmless, teams respond quickly. When it is dangerous, they advise silence, because silence limits liability. Blake Lively, too, has retreated from any public commentary that might deepen the narrative. Gone are the confident appearances. Gone are the casual remarks. Gone is the assumption that this would quietly go away. Instead, what remains is a legal clock counting down toward trial. And with every day that passes, the pressure increases. Public relations professionals understand something very important. You cannot outspin court documents. You can redirect attention. You can delay responses. You can release carefully worded statements. But once filings exist, the facts, or at least the claims, are frozen in time. And journalists, analysts, and legal observers are now studying those filings closely. What they see is not chaos, but coordination. And coordination is much harder to explain away. For those who remember a time when reputation was built over decades and destroyed in moments, this is deeply concerning. Because it suggests that influence was used casually, almost carelessly, under the assumption that it would never be scrutinized. That assumption appears to have been wrong. One of the most striking developments is the apparent distancing between Taylor Swift and Blake Lively. For years, their friendship was visible, celebrated, and mutually beneficial in terms of public image. Now that visibility is gone. No shared appearances, no public support, no acknowledgement. And while neither has confirmed a rift, those who understand crisis management recognize what this likely means. When one person's legal exposure threatens another's brand, separation becomes necessary. Not because of betrayal, but because of survival. Taylor Swift's team is known for its precision. Every move is calculated. Every association is evaluated. And right now, the risk of being tied to a case involving alleged strategic interference is simply too high. For an artist whose legacy depends on trust, authenticity, and connection with her audience, particularly older fans who value consistency, even the appearance of dishonesty is dangerous. That's why this silence matters, because it suggests that responding would require explanations that are difficult to reconcile with past statements. Meanwhile, Blake Lively faces a different kind of challenge. Her public persona has long been that of a confident, capable professional, someone who balances creativity with collaboration. But the narrative emerging from court filings paints a far more aggressive picture. One of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, alliance building, and narrative control. And once that image takes hold, it is very difficult to reverse, especially when other powerful figures are mentioned. Because now it's not just about one lawsuit. It's about who else might be pulled in. People with studios, people with contracts, people with reputations built on neutrality and professionalism. And those people are now doing exactly what risk advisors recommend: stepping back. No statements, no endorsements, no public alignment, because no one wants their name added to a document they haven't read. This retreat is not an admission of guilt by anyone, but it is an acknowledgement of danger. As the trial approaches, every word spoken publicly could be introduced as evidence. Every inconsistency could be highlighted. Every denial could be challenged. And for celebrities accustomed to controlling the narrative, that loss of control is deeply unsettling. This is why we're seeing what feels like a sudden freeze. It's why media coverage has shifted tone, from admiration to analysis. And it's why public opinion is beginning to change. For viewers aged 65 and older, there's an added layer here. Many of you grew up believing that success should be earned honestly. That power should be acknowledged responsibly. That leadership carries accountability. When it appears that influence was exercised quietly while the public was told otherwise, it feels like a betrayal, not just of fans but of shared values. That's why this case resonates beyond Hollywood, because it reflects a broader concern about transparency in positions of power. As the days tick closer to trial, legal teams are preparing, PR teams are advising restraint, and everyone involved is calculating exposure. Because once testimony begins, once evidence is presented, the opportunity to shape the narrative disappears. And that is what makes this moment so significant. Not because of who said what in private, but because of what those private words reveal about public behavior. As this case moves toward trial, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This is no longer just about one film, one director, or one dispute. This is about what happens when influence operates quietly, and then suddenly finds itself under a courtroom spotlight. Because courts do not care about star power. They care about records. They care about timelines. They care about consistency. And most importantly, they care about whether public statements align with private actions. That is why the coming months are so critical. Once testimony begins, once evidence is presented, and once private communications are examined in full context, there will be no room for interpretation through public relations language. The story will be told through facts, or at least through claims that must be answered under oath. And for the individuals involved, that represents a loss of control unlike anything they've experienced before. For Taylor Swift, the implications are long-term. Her career has been built on connection and trust, not just with younger fans, but with older audiences who value consistency, honesty, and accountability. If this case confirms that her public denials conflict with documented involvement, the damage will not be immediate, but it will be lasting. Because trust, once shaken, rarely returns to its original form. This does not mean her career ends, but it does mean her image may shift from untouched icon to powerful participant. And that distinction matters. For Blake Lively, the stakes are different but equally serious. If the court accepts the argument that she coordinated influence to override contractual authority, the consequences could extend beyond this case. Studios may become cautious. Producers may hesitate. Future collaborations may come with stricter boundaries. Because no one wants to risk a project being destabilized by informal power networks operating behind the scenes. And that is where this case could have industry-wide impact. If it establishes clearer limits on how far celebrity influence can go, especially when it is not contractually defined, it may reshape how productions are structured going forward. Directors may seek stronger protections. Studios may formalize decision-making chains. And celebrity involvement may become more transparent, not less. For those watching who have lived through decades of institutional change, this feels like a necessary correction. Because unchecked power, no matter how glamorous, eventually demands accountability. What is perhaps most striking is how quickly alliances appear to dissolve when legal exposure enters the picture. People who once stood together now stand apart. Names once associated now remain unspoken. And the silence, again, speaks volumes. Because in moments like this, loyalty takes a back seat to self-preservation. That is not cynicism, it is reality. As trial approaches, more information may emerge. More communications may surface. And the public may learn things that challenge long-held assumptions about how decisions are really made in Hollywood. For older viewers especially, this may feel both familiar and disappointing. Familiar because you've seen similar dynamics in other powerful institutions. Disappointing because celebrity culture often promises authenticity and delivers image management instead. But there is also something encouraging here. Because transparency, even when uncomfortable, creates the possibility for change. It forces industries to reflect. It forces individuals to answer hard questions. And it reminds the public that no one is above scrutiny, no matter how celebrated. This case is not about taking sides. It is not about defending or condemning personalities. It is about recognizing a moment when influence met accountability, and the outcome remains uncertain. As viewers, as citizens, and as people who value integrity, the most important thing is to watch carefully, to question narratives, to distinguish between admiration and absolution, and to remember that power, when exercised quietly, still carries responsibility. The trial will proceed, the facts will be argued, and reputations, deserved or not, will be affected. But one thing is already certain: Hollywood will not walk away from this unchanged. Because once the curtain is pulled back, it cannot be fully closed again. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real story here. If you found this breakdown thoughtful, I encourage you to share your perspective in the comments below. Do you believe celebrity influence has gone too far? Or is this simply how the industry works? If you appreciate clear, consistent analysis without hype, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon for the next update.